Mad is the word. The word that reminds me of 6th grade. I hated that year. I wish I had known what was going to be going on during my 6th grade year, the last and worst year of elementary school. Mad is the word that remains in my head about my dreadful year as a 6th grader. My madness was one that was caused by disappointments that hurt me very much. Disappointments from my teacher, such as field trips that were planned, then cancelled. My 6th grade teacher gave me a lot of disappointments that made me very mad, and made me build a state of hatred in my heart. No one ever let me down that hard before, and I never hated anyone as much as I did him. Disappointment wasn't the only reason that made me mad in my 6th grade class. Another was getting in trouble at school, especially talking. That was what really bugged me, was writing sentences, those awful sentences that my teacher made me write. Hours and hours I'd sit and write 50, 10, 150 sentences day and night. I'd write those dreadful paragraphs, which embarrassed me, and more important, it made me ashamed of myself, which in turn, deep down inside, made me realize that writing sentence wasn't fair. It wasn't fair to make me suffer like that. It wasn't fair to make me sit and write until my bones ached, until my hand felt every horrid pain it ever had, and as I wrote, I got madder and madder until I cried. I cried because I was ashamed. I cried because I was disgusted. I cried because I was mad, and I cried for myself, kid who kept on having to write those damn sentences. My angriness from 6th grade will scar my memory for life, and I will be ashamed of my 6th grade year forever.
Imagine knowing that the criminal known as the original Night Stalker, also called the East Area Rapist and the Golden State Killer by others, has been inside your home. You've been watching the news, so you recognize all of the signs. You've been getting the type of hang-up calls associated with this psychopathic madman, and you've been getting them for weeks. Perhaps he asked you if a man named Ray is there before hanging up. Maybe you noticed a door or a window ajar when getting home from work. Or you've noticed some family photos have been moved around by someone other than yourself. So you become diligent. When you get home, you check your windows for any disturbances. The East Area Rapist, as he was called during this time period, was known to cut holes in window screens and unlock the windows that way. You'd likely make sure that all of your doors and windows have stayed locked throughout the day, and you're more than likely going to slowly, cautiously check behind your shower curtain and any closed closet doors. But as you're searching your house, which is located nearby a deep gully right next to railroad tracks, the type of house that would immediately attract this serial offender, you notice something. A wedding photo has been taken out of its picture frame, and surprisingly been placed on top of a notepad inside of a desk drawer. You just used the notepad yesterday, and your spouse hasn't used it in days. Now you're scared, but you're holding out hope that is a simple mistake, a small misunderstanding. Then, upon a more thorough search of the house, you find a rolled-up coil of rope hidden under a couch cushion. There's only one possible explanation for that, and it's a terrifying one. The original Night Stalker has been inside your house, and he's planning on making you his next victim. What some may call paranoia saved a family from untold horror on one night in December of 1978. The East Area Rapist had been active for over 2 years at this point, and was now continuing his venture south from Sacramento into more centralized California. Following the hints given to them from the news media and the police, this family was able to find the clues that put them in the sights of one of the most violent serial offenders in human history, and allowed them to avoid tragedy altogether. Unfortunately, just as everything else in this case, it didn't stop the offender from finding another family to torment. At this point in his career, the original Night Stalker wasn't lacking for victims. Now it's time to get what you're all waiting for, part 3 of the original Night Stalker. July 5th, 1979. It's just about 3:30 in the morning, on the day after a national holiday in Danville, California, when neighbors are woken up by the sounds of screams. It's not usual to hear loud sounds coming from this house in particular, as the homeowners, a man named Bill and his wife, were quiet people, so it was quite the shock to hear them causing a ruckus this early in the morning. Bill and his wife had previously talked about what they would do if the East Area Rapist ever set his sights on them. While Bill would attack the masked intruder, his wife would make a break for it to try and get outside and get some neighborly assistance, or at least alert people to what was happening. So on this night, Bill, a light sleeper by nature, was alerted to the sound of rustling. When he looked up, he saw a mirror's reflection of a man pulling a mask over his head. Instead of lying still and waiting to be assaulted, Bill woke up his wife by enacting the plan. He was screaming and rushing this masked intruder before his wife even knew what was happening, but she quickly caught on. It was one of the first times that the East Area Rapist had met a match, and while he himself was quick to react, he clearly hadn't planned for such an occasion. He was usually the one surprising his victims, not the other way around. This masked intruder had nearly been bested by a bound, middle-aged mother just a year or so beforehand, and Bill now had the jump on him. Bill wasn't just bigger than the rapist, he was much bigger. While the neighbors were alerted by the wife's screams for help, it was Bill's roars that gave them a cause for concern. "Who the fuck do you think you are?" Bill shouted at the East Area Rapist as he rushed him. "Get the fuck out of here now and you can leave." The neighbors, awake and alert and likely trying to find out what was happening, didn't just sit on their laurels as so many of the other neighbors of victims had done. They called the cops as soon as possible, and just minutes after Bill had scared off this would-be attacker, the cops arrived with dogs to track the scent. The dogs followed this scent into a nearby patch of ivy, which was so potent that it caused one of the dogs to jump into it, believing the suspect was still there. It was apparently so strong in this rapist odor that detectives believed he had been there just moments beforehand. If it wasn't for the damp environment that led to the end of the perpetrator's trail, they might have been able to capture him. The East Area Rapist was lucky on this fated morning, as he managed to evade capture yet again. However, if we are to believe that the East Area Rapist is the same person as the Visalia ransacker, then this will have been the second close encounter with law enforcement that he had, and it would be the second time he all but disappeared. Where we left off at the end of part 2, after the murder of Brian and Katie Majore in early 1978, the East Area Rapist had moved south of Sacramento into other areas. While he returned to Sacramento on occasion, he began to torment other areas such as Stockton, Danville, San Jose, Fremont, Concord, and Modesto. His MO had remained the same since leaving Sacramento, but no one could argue that he was running out of steam. By this point, in July of 1979, he had assaulted nearly 50 different families, and he had terrorized countless others through unknown home invasions, quick phone calls, or his notorious late-night and early-morning prowling. It's even possible that he had additional victims that refused to come forward and report their assaults, not wanting to go through the painstaking ordeals again and again. In 1978, police hounds had followed the scent of the East Area Rapist from a victim's house to a field, where they found a piece of ripped-up notebook paper next to tire tracks. This paper contained the angsty rant you heard in the introduction of the show, and it had been seemingly left behind by the East Area Rapist himself. Whether it was accidentally left behind, purposefully done so, or if it even belonged to the East Area Rapist himself isn't a sure thing. But after allegedly sending a poem to a local television station the previous year, which you heard in episode 2 of this podcast, many began to assume that this was the perpetrator's way of goading the police. Into what, we have no idea. The East Area Rapist would always operate under the same guideline. He would wake up a couple with a threat. He would usually be aiming a gun at them and shining a bright flashlight into their face. And he would present them with an option: to either die in bed lying next to their loved one, or to comply with him and live to see another day. The East Area Rapist would often tell them that he was just there for the money, and he would give them some melodramatic line about being gone in the dark of the night if they only complied. Then he would give the woman shoelaces that she would use to tie up her own husband or boyfriend. Oftentimes, the shoelaces came from the victim's own shoes. On rare occasions, the East Area Rapist would bring his own pre-cut sections of rope with him, or he would tear strips from the family's towels. He would bind his victims, hand and foot, and blindfold them to the best of his ability. More often than not, the perpetrator would utilize a specific type of knot known as the diamond knot, which isn't very well known to anyone outside of the nautical field. On more than one occasion, the victims would be found hours later with their hands tied so tightly that they were black due to the lack of circulation. He would rape the women, maybe more than once, and he would stack dishes on top of the husband or boyfriend's back to make sure they didn't try to free themselves. When he wasn't raping or terrifying his victims, he was walking around, more than half crazed, tearing apart the family home but not really stealing anything. At most, he would steal the family's wedding rings or photographs, but he left most things of value behind. He would eat leftover food from their refrigerator, often taking breaks to do just that or even step outside. Detectives found bottles or cans of beer outside many of the crime scenes, most of the time the beer not belonging to the victim. This was a violent offender that came prepared, even for the post-game celebration that he threw himself. But throughout many of the assaults, the East Area Rapist had a dark side that he tried to hide. As he worked his way south, many victims began to report hearing him cry in other rooms, often repeating the word "mommy" to himself. When he performed the despicable act of rape itself, he oftentimes wouldn't even become aroused. Many of the victims recalled his penis as being unusually small, and even more so when he struggled to maintain an erection, which was quite constantly. And now, after his close encounter with defeat in Danville, the East Area Rapist would set his sights elsewhere. Months after the failure in Danville, California, a couple was woken up to a flashlight in their face, a kick on their bed, and a voice urging them to wake up. The date was October 2nd, and the setting was Goleta, California, a smaller town located in Santa Barbara County. Goleta is located just 2 hours west of Los Angeles, and is hundreds of miles south of anywhere that our perpetrator had assaulted as of yet. The couple complied with the perpetrator and his demands, even when it became clear that he wasn't interested in their money. He made sure that the husband was properly tied up by the wife, before binding her hands and leading her into another room. He bound her hands so tightly that it didn't just restrict blood flow, it cut it off entirely. Throughout this ordeal, the perpetrator kept murmuring to himself under his breath, "I'll kill him, I'll kill him," he kept repeating, while the poor wife laid on her own living room floor, bound and now blindfolded. The perpetrator did as he always did, rummaging the house in small bursts before returning to threaten the victims some more. But in this case, the perpetrator's eclectic burst of energy would almost be his undoing. While he paced around the house, threatening to murder the couple under his breath, the woman tried to make a break for it. Still bound and blindfolded, she hopped her way to the front door, falling into the wall once and likely alerting this attacker. She managed to open the front door with her nearly numb hands and hop outside, her leg bindings now falling off. She tried to make a run for freedom and was screaming for her life. Unfortunately, her rapid momentum led her directly into an outer wall of the house, stopping her. She ran right into it at full speed. The perpetrator would rush to grab her and take her back inside, but at this point, the damage had been done. The husband, bound in the bedroom, had heard the screams of his wife at the front of the house, and began desperately trying to work himself free of at least his leg bindings. Thankfully, this couple lived next door to an FBI agent who was staying up late at night to read a book. The front of his house faced this one, and when he heard some screams erupting, however muffled, it must have caught his attention. He began to dial 911 to alert the authorities, and in the meantime tried to find his pistol. As the perpetrator dragged the wife back inside, continuing his threats, he made his way to the back bedroom where he found the couple's sliding glass door opened. The husband was gone. Unknown to the attacker, he was hiding underneath a nearby orange bush, but for all intents and purposes, he had escaped. The masked intruder rushed to the front of the house to find that the wife had escaped out the front door yet again. Just like the last assault in Danville, this one had failed horribly. The perpetrator began to make his escape, using a bicycle that detectives would later find out was stolen from a block or two away. But during this escape, the perpetrator encountered our friendly neighborhood FBI agent, who began to give pursuit in his car. After a few blocks of evading the FBI neighbor's car, the perpetrator would abandon the bike and hop over a fence. Not wanting to face a grisly fate while climbing the fence himself, the FBI agent refrained from further chasing the suspect, knowing that the police were inbound and just moments away. When he returned to his house, he found the wife in his yard, naked and terrified, but unharmed. The husband would later be found in the backyard, still bound at his wrist and ankles, hiding in the same shrub he had escaped to. He too was unharmed, but thoroughly terrified. Fortunately for this couple, they had survived a terrifying assault. Unfortunately, they would be the last couple that the original Night Stalker would ever leave alive. The local area detectives believed that this was just a failed B&E, seeing as there was no sexual assault and the East Area Rapist was located hours away. While the ligatures themselves raised some suspicion, the failure and location of the assault made it appear to be a copycat, nothing more and probably nothing less. They would find out months later that their assumption was dead wrong. December 30th, 1979. Just days after Christmas, and a single day before New Year's Eve, The city of Goleta, California must be in a seasonal mood. The East Area Rapist seemingly hadn't assaulted anyone since July, and outside of the botched late-night robbery in early October, Goleta had been a normal town. Unfortunately, this would be the first time that the original Night Stalker would leave his victims behind without the ability to recount their terror to investigators. Some neighbors awoke a short time after 3 o'clock in the morning, believing that they had heard a firecracker in the distance. It might have been so muffled and faint that it simply kicked them out of sleep, and they weren't quite sure what they had heard. But then it happened again, 3 more times in quick succession. They still weren't sure, as it might have been some kids firing off some fireworks ahead of the New Year's holiday. So they remained cautiously alert, waiting for it to happen again, just to be sure. It happened one more time, and hours later, those neighbors would find out the reason. Dr. Robert Offerman lived in the Goleta condo, and sleeping next to him was his girlfriend, Dr. Deborah Manning. Robert, along with her other friends, called her Debbie. Debbie was technically still married, but had recently filed for divorce from her husband and had made her relationship with Robert public the week beforehand, when the two had hosted a Christmas party for medical and legal professionals. Both details, the Christmas party and her divorce, would go on to mar the case with relevant and irrelevant details later on. When their bodies were discovered, there was a white cord around Robert's wrist, but he wasn't fully bound. It was likely that, in the process of being awoken and tied up, Dr. Robert Offerman had decided to fight back for his life. Unfortunately, he had encountered this mysterious attacker when the attacker had all but given up on mercy, and he had been shot 4 times with a .38 pistol as a result. His body was found right as he had fallen. It appeared that the last fatal gunshot was reserved for Dr. Debbie Manning herself. She was found, still bound, and lying face down on Dr. Offerman's bed with a single gunshot to the head. We can't even begin to imagine the amount of terror these two must have lived with in their final moments. What detectives found at the crime scene is eerily similar to the traits given to the East Area Rapist. Outside of the murder itself, this played out exactly like something from our original culprit's playbook. He attacked the victims while they were sleeping in bed, just hours after the two had been intimate. This would not only become a trend for the South California victims, but it had been becoming commonplace in the Sacramento area assaults before our perpetrator disappeared. The attacker of these 2 doctors had also turned off the condo's thermostat entirely, and he had also turned off all of the lights. A betting man would surmise that this attacker had some aversion to heat, and perhaps even a sensitivity to light. The East Area Rapist had been openly hostile towards heaters in the houses he attacked in Sacramento, sometimes going as far as trying to break them to turn them off, and his propensity for striking in the dark and the cool of night had been commonplace. Some paint chips were found on the victim, which later would connect this case to theories regarding construction workers or professional painters. This attacker even helped himself to Dr. Offerman's Christmas leftovers, presumably after murdering this couple in their bed. Unfortunately, this attack happened in the last days of the 1970s, when information wasn't as readily available as it is now. While detectives nowadays might be able to piece 1 and 2 together by utilizing internet resources and streamlined communication, things weren't like this forever. Looking back at this crime, knowing what we do, it's easy to surmise that this was the work of the East Area Rapist. But it wasn't until the late 90s and early 2000s that DNA would permanently link these Northern and Southern Californian crimes together. In her last minutes, Debbie had hidden the jewelry she was wearing in the crack separating the bed from the wall. So, unfortunately, as far as Santa Barbara detectives were concerned, this was just another botched robbery. In the years since, detectives have tried to find a common thread connecting all of the victims. For some cases, it's a common gas station car wash. For others, it's the Alpha Beta Market, a California-based grocery store chain that many of the victims frequented, which was eventually bought out by other companies in 1995. But one of the links that keeps showing its ugly head in every investigation is the original Night Stalker's connection to the medical field. Many of his North California victims were doctors or nurses, or had even recently been to the doctor or described pharmaceuticals. And now, 2 more doctors were murdered in their home, just days after hosting a party for co-workers and other related professionals. One would almost like to see a copy of that party's guest list, just to see if any of the names pop up interest. In the days after the murder, noticing that not many of the condo's valuables had been taken, the investigation focused on the former spouses of both Dr. Offerman and Dr. Manning, the former of which was neck-deep in a divorce with multiple assets, and the latter who had just started the divorce proceedings. Of course, both of these investigations would lead to a dead end, but other interesting information would arise. One of the nearby neighbors of Dr. Offerman was a young registered nurse who had just started a job at a nearby hospital. She found twine inside her house, and when detectives searched the house, they found more instances of the same twine, hidden in plain sight that could make for our perpetrators easy access. The same type of twine would be found multiple times, seemingly all over the area. It would be found inside other houses, in backyards, in garage, even in a nearby open field. Right next to the twine found in the open field were footprints. These footprints matched the size and shoe type of not only the East Area Rapist, but our current attacker as well. An interesting note is that right beside the human footprints were that of a dog. These dog prints seemed to keep pace right next to the human tracks, and it made it seem as if our aggressive prowler had begun bringing his pet along with him in certain instances. Because, after all, who suspects the man that's just out walking his dog? Speaking of dogs, an interesting occurrence happened at around this point. The break-ins that can be expected from the original Night Stalker were happening all over the area, and one family came home from an event earlier than expected. Through their living room window, they could see a dark figure moving about quickly, as if he had not anticipated being interrupted. They rushed inside, likely to scare him off and to alert the police, but he was already gone, having vaulted over the back fence before they even made it inside their house. But they would find out that their family hadn't been unharmed. Not entirely. Their dog, which had been inside the house, had suffered an injury to its eye, an injury perpetrated by none other than the masked intruder. This was clearly an individual that wasn't interested in just raping his victims anymore. This was a terrorist that wanted to inflict as much pain as inhumanly possible. On March 13th, 1980, the perpetrator would strike again, this time in Ventura, California, about 40 miles east, closer to Los Angeles itself. Lyman Smith was a 43-year-old lawyer, a beacon of the community who was well on his way to being appointed judge. Charlene was his 33-year-old wife, a beautiful younger woman that everyone adored. Charlene had been married twice before, and Lyman had been married once, having a few children from that previous union. His 12-year-old son, Gary, primarily lived at his mother's house, but was headed over to his father's house to do some yard work. Lyman insisted that his children had to earn their allowance, so Gary got his by mowing lawns and doing other miscellaneous yard work. Gary was shocked to find the front door unlocked, and to find the state of the house in such disarray. But that was nothing compared to what he must have felt when he found his father and his stepmom dead in their own bed. Lyman and Charlene Smith were still bound, Lyman by Charlene's hand, and Charlene with the original Night Stalker's notorious diamond knot. A blanket had been draped over their bodies, and the nearby wall was splattered with their blood. This was the first time that detectives became enamored with the knot used to tie Charlene, known as the diamond knot, and also called the decorator's knot or the Chinese knot by others. It was an intricately folded knot that very few people knew how to tie. Investigators would try and find some symbolism there, as Charlene was a decorator herself, and some detectives thought there might be some connection between the two. This time, our perpetrator had not been quick or gentle, instead choosing to beat both victims to death with a log found just outside the house. and unlike the last set of victims, Charlene had been raped before her death. The investigation would soon turn on some of Lyman's business associates, one of which spent an entire year in jail facing trial before being exonerated. The investigators wouldn't link this crime scene to the nearby Goleta double murder until much later, due to the presence of rape, the means of killing, and the location. It would be much, much later that this crime would be connected to the original Night Stalker, but he was nowhere near done. August 19th, 1980. Dana Point is a small town in Orange County, perhaps the perfect embodiment of the Southern California beach community. Located just south of Los Angeles, it's exactly the type of place a young couple would love to build a foundation on which to comfortably spend the rest of their lives together. For Keith and Patty Harrington, it was just that. Keith was a 24-year-old that was in his third year of med school, and he was preparing to begin a medical internship that would help set him up for life. Patrice, who was called Patty by everyone in her life, was slightly older, a 27-year-old registered nurse. The two had known each other for less than a year, but had gotten married just months prior, in May, and lived together in a small gated community in what most people would describe as paradise. The house belonged to Keith's father, Roger, a self-made man that loved his children and was more than happy to let them live there until Keith graduated later that year. Unfortunately, after being invited over for dinner by Patty days prior, it was Roger who found the bodies of his son and his new daughter-in-law in bed, with the covers draped over them just like the prior victims. Patty had been raped, records would later state. Keith had been killed by what looked like a single blow to the head, maybe two, but Patty had been beaten repeatedly with an unknown object. There was a piece of brass that would later be uncovered from the wounds on her head, and detectives assumed that the perpetrator had used a piece of brass piping from outside, where Roger had been installing a sprinkler system in his spare time. The bindings had been cut from the victims after their deaths, perhaps as a way for this perpetrator to hide his way of tying. The diamond knot had specifically been noted on the last victim, and it was possible that this was a clue to his identity that he wanted to keep hidden. One thing was pretty unique about this killing, in that the location itself didn't match the perpetrator's usual hunting grounds. He usually picked houses located nearby ravines, creek beds, rivers, alleys, open fields, places where he could stalk his prey uninterrupted. But this house was in a gated community, and it wasn't nearby any of those things. It was as if the killer wasn't interested in retreading the same ground, and wanted to simply cause pain. Years later, Keith Harrington's brother, Bruce, would champion the cause of Proposition 69, now a California state law that requires all criminals to give samples of their DNA to the state of California's DNA database. He put up millions of his own dollars to the campaign in this painstaking effort to get the law passed, and it has helped ensure that killers like this never develop again. So, while Keith and Patty Harrington's murder remains a tragedy of the highest caliber, there was a slight sliver of good that came out of it, as Proposition 69 has become a common practice throughout the United States justice system. At this point, detectives were stumped. The crimes were so spread out and so different that detectives were still slow on accepting that they were the works of the same serial offender. Detective Richard Shelby, now off of the East Area Rapist case, was eager to point out similarities between his perpetrator and this new Southern California murderer, but other detectives weren't as gung-ho. This is when the original Night Stalker entered another one of his lull periods. This wasn't the first, and it wouldn't be the last, but it's noticeable to point out that he didn't attack again until February 6th, which is about half a year later. February 6th, 1981. Manuela Whelan was a 28-year-old housewife that had been employed as a mortgage broker for the time being. Her husband, David, was in the hospital with a viral infection of sorts, so she was home alone. Her father had insisted that she allow the family's German Shepherd to stay at the house with her, but she refused. She felt safe in her own home, although she had a weird quirk of sleeping in a sleeping bag when she was home alone. For her, a sleeping bag meant safety. Little is known of how or when Manuela was found, but she was found in her sleeping bag, brutally murdered at the hands of this psychopath. Bruises were found on her wrist, which implied that she had been pretty tightly bound, and there were other bruises found on her body, implying that the perpetrator had been rather rough and violent. For some reason, this attacker had tried to make this attack look like a burglary. A lamp, which might have been the murder weapon, and a valueless crystal ball had been taken. But besides that, nothing of value had been stolen. Another notable missing item was the tape from the house's answering machine, which led detectives to believe that whoever was responsible knew the victim or her husband. The family television was found in the backyard, perhaps in the hopes of making this look like a burglary gone wrong, but investigators would later look through this guise. A notable find was a screwdriver, which the perpetrator had used to unlock the back sliding glass door. The screwdriver itself was rather plain, but a brown paint stain on the handle would later go on to be a point of interest in the investigation. For the longest time, Manuela's husband, David, was a primary suspect in the case, although his hospital stay should have been enough to eliminate him as a suspect. In 1997, DNA would later prove that this case was connected to the original Night Stalker, but, at the time, this was just another robbery gone wrong for detectives. July 27th, 1981. It had now been nearly 2 years since the perpetrator struck in Goleta, beginning to slow his pace of crime significantly. For some reason, on this night at the end of July, he decided to return to this small Southern California town. The crime took place not far from where the other assaults in Goleta had taken place, along the San Jose Creek. This night, the victims would be 35-year-old Sherry Domingo and her 28-year-old boyfriend, Greg Sanchez. Sherry had been staying at the house, having recently been laid off from her job at a company involved with computers, a company that Greg still worked for. The house belonged to a relative of Sherry's that had recently passed away, so she had elected to stay there and help oversee the house while the real estate company tried to sell it. The day before the murders, a younger man had asked to see the house and requested a tour. Detectives would later find that a screen to a window he had looked at had been removed during this tour, and it might have been one of the main components of the later breaking and entering. Eyewitnesses would spot a similarly aged young man around the neighborhood the day of the murder, and more than one eyewitness saw this young man, who had longer, light hair, with a similarly light-haired German Shepherd. A neighbor would later recall hearing a single gunshot, but wouldn't tell the police because they weren't sure of what they had heard. A neighbor would recall hearing a gunshot that night, but they didn't call the police because they weren't sure of what they had heard. The real estate agent would return to the house the next day, and he found the dead bodies in the bedroom. Greg Sanchez, still naked from the night before, was found dead with his body halfway in the closet, as if he had been taken unawares. He had been shot once in the cheek, a non-fatal wound, and then he had been hit in the head repeatedly until he had been killed. Sherry Domingo had been raped by this psychopath, hogtied, and then her head had been bashed in repeatedly. The ties had been cut off and taken away by the perpetrator after the act itself, but the markings and the scene itself made clear what had happened. It wasn't until the later DNA testing happened that proved this incident was the work of the same masked intruder that had been plaguing California for the better part of 5 years. But now his presence was beginning to be felt in Southern California. It was time, once again, for the original Night Stalker to disappear. In perhaps the most baffling thing of the original Night Stalker's criminal career, he disappeared for the better part of 5 years. He had been gone from the Sacramento area for years at this point, and was quick on his way to becoming the thing of legend, even in Southern California, with more recent crimes and a body count piling up. The original Night Stalker's case file was starting to get cold. The investigation continued, but as we can look back over the past 30 years to see, nothing came of it. Suspects came and went, some more interesting than others, but they always went. Then, on May 4th, 1986, nearly 5 years after the murder of Sherry Domingo and Greg Sanchez, the original Night Stalker would strike for the final time. Janelle Cruz was an 18-year-old young woman with her entire life in front of her. She was a cashier at a local pizza place, and she was presumably a part of the mid-1980s culture that was all about having fun. Her parents had gone to Mexico on vacation, and despite the fact that the family house was for sale, Janelle decided to stay behind. It was a Sunday night, and Janelle had a male friend over earlier in the evening. The two of them were just friends, not dating, and while they were hanging out, they heard multiple sounds outside the home. The young male friend would later recount these details to police, but he remembered the two of them looking outside Janelle's bedroom window and not investigating any further. The sound might have been the gate to the backyard closing, or the door to the garage being shut. They didn't know because they chose not to investigate beyond the bedroom window. Sometime between 10:30 and 11 o'clock that night, Janelle said goodbye to her friend, and then followed him out to her own car. She dropped by a local store to grab some supplies, and then she was never seen alive again. Just like some of the prior incidents, Janelle's body was found by a real estate agent the following morning. Blood was found in the kitchen, leading detectives to believe that the perpetrator had surprised her there, hitting her with a pipe wrench that would forever remain missing from the family garage. Then he had taken her to the bedroom, where she would be found hours later, with signs of being bound, gagged, raped, and then brutally murdered. The Cruz family home was no more than a mile away from where Manuela Withune had been murdered years previously, so it was located right in the original Night Stalker's Southern California hunting grounds. Yet, just like the other cases, it wasn't until DNA testing years later that this case would be attributed to the same psychopathic killer. The time between the crimes was just too vast, too unexplainable for detectives. From here on out, everything we know about the original Night Stalker is purely hypothetical, gossip built upon theories, old evidence, and presumptions. No one knows why the original Night Stalker did the things he did, or why he chose to wait 5 years in between his strings of brutal killings and the final senseless murder of Janelle Cruz. Many have theorized that he was in prison for unrelated offenses, or that he might have been in the military, gone from the area for the duration of the early 1980s. For all we know, he was a contractor of sorts with a family, and he spent the early 1980s helping raise his children, and he couldn't sacrifice large chunks of his evenings so he could go out and stalk and prowl other couples. Out of all of the cases, over 50 of them, there are connections to be made. But over the past 40 years, the most experienced detectives and investigators have struggled to make sense of it all. Was this unknown attacker a construction worker, as surmised by some of the evidence left behind? Was he a doctor, or somehow involved with the medical field with ties to many of the victims? Was he a military member, as that would help explain his physical abilities and the location of the crimes? Was he involved in education, seeing as many of his victims were either educators, teachers, or younger students? Was he a real estate agent, which would help explain why so many of his victims' houses were, or lived next to other houses that were, for sale? We honestly just don't know. And that's what's so terrifying about this killer. For someone that relied on a large amount of luck to remain unknown, this killer has evaded some of the best detectives in the world for a lifetime. And what's even scarier is that because he struck when he was young, he can likely still be out there. For all we know, he could be your neighbor, he could be your brother, he could be your dad, he could be your grandpa, your uncle, a co-worker, anyone. Even his identity in the pantheon of Californian serial killers was unknown. It wasn't until the late 1990s and early 2000s that DNA linked together many of the cases, decades after the assaults and murders had taken place. In Sacramento, the legend of the East Area Rapist still loomed large after the years of terror placed on innocent citizens. But in Southern California, these seemed to be largely unrelated murders that happened to occur in the golden age of the serial killer. Even the name of this unknown assailant was derived years later, when compared to the more well-known serial killer Richard Ramirez. Investigators and journalists realized that this criminal had the MO perfected years before Ramirez himself turned to a life of violent crime, thus making him the original Night Stalker. We don't know how many total victims this suspect created, because unfortunately, most of his victims never even knew he existed. He operated in the shadows of society, striking whenever his victims were away or asleep, lurking just outside or even inside their homes. To him, anywhere was available for him to creep, and he seemed to relish feeling the intimacy of other families' homes. It's very possible that this unknown assailant has a collection of trophies taken from his years as a killer. A large assortment of wedding rings, lost family photographs, murder weapons, small mementos or tokens taken from other homes. It would be nice to say that there are positive updates to be made, but despite the hard work being done by detectives to this day, there isn't much progress that can be accounted for. This case has become one for the ages, and despite many suspects that fit the bill, including a fellow known as Carlos, the detective Richard Shelby, and others, none have been arrested in connection to the rapes and murders. As I've stated multiple times during this podcast, DNA has gone on to connect all of the Northern California sexual assaults to the Southern California murders. Until the DNA proved it, the separate cases were linked together only in motive and detective guesswork. But now we know for a fact that the cases are connected by the same perpetrator. Whether or not he had an accomplice or other copycats is anyone's guess. But these cases we know for sure happened, and they were perpetrated by him. In 2004, Proposition 69 was passed by Bruce Harrington, one of the victim's brothers, who wanted to ensure that things like this could never happen again. Now, criminals in prison are required to give up DNA to the state database. On September 21st, 2015, the United States Air Force Office of Special Investigations, also known as the AFOSI, announced that it was still looking into the murder of Brian and Katie Majore. While this was bitter news for people hoping for a happy ending, it just shows that while the crimes may have been committed a generation ago, the authorities are restless in trying to find justice for those taken too soon. While many believe that the perpetrator may be dead or long gone, authorities believe that they will find the perpetrator any day now. Detectives have never given up on the case, and it remains one of California's most notorious unsolved mysteries. Despite the little-known nature of the original Night Stalker, the case has remained in the public's eye, not only because of the published works of the original detectives Larry Crompton and Richard Shelby, but also because of a strong internet presence and the reporting of the LA Times' Micheal Whelan. If you would like to learn more about the original Night Stalker, you can do so by joining the EAR/ONS Pro Board online. This remains one of the most vibrant, active communities of people discussing the case, evidence, and theories. You can also check out the Quester Files online. The Quester Files are a large, ever-growing case file on live, archived by one man who has done so much for the publicity of this case and archiving the knowledge needed to keep it going. You can also definitely learn more detail by checking out the published works of two of the original detectives, Larry Crompton and Richard Shelby. Both of their books, Sudden Terror and Hunting a Psychopath, respectively, give great detail about each case and really give you a good idea of how the investigation itself unfolded. Micheal McNamara is penning an upcoming book on the subject, in which she is going to attempt to rebrand the killer with the moniker of the Golden State Killer. Be sure to be on the lookout for that, as it's undoubtedly going to be a treasure trove of information. And lastly, if you have any information about the case, please contact the California state authorities. This is still one of the largest open cases in America, so any information that could lead to the arrest of the culprit is of the utmost priority. While a part of me is sad that my look at the original Night Stalker is coming to an end, a much larger part of me is glad that it's done. While there was a nice gap between episode 2 and this one, I can assure you that the research and the nights spent listening for any sound outside my window didn't stop. I make no claim to be the utmost authority on the original Night Stalker, so I merely hope that you enjoyed this podcast and continue the investigation on your own. I may have flubbed up on some of the facts, and I definitely messed up some of the smaller details. So I hope that you take it among yourselves to help stay involved and correct me. After all, we all want the same thing. This guy to be found. I know that someday he will be. I just hope that it's soon. I would really like to thank all of you, not only for taking the time out of your day to listen to my boring voice, but for the kind words, the compliments, the advice, and the support. I'm definitely working on making this podcast better with each passing day, so they're not falling on deaf ears, I can promise you that. I would also like to thank all of the sources of information that unknowingly contributed to this episode, and I'll be linking to all of those on the podcast website, theunresolvedpodcast.com. You can find the links, along with a transcript of the show and audio links, there as well. You can even contact us on Twitter, @unresolvedp, still funny, and also at Facebook, at facebook.com/theunresolvedpodcast. If you have an email, and you're old school, you can also do it that way, theunresolvedpodcast@gmail.com. Speaking of audio links, I would really like to thank all of the musical artists that have contributed music to the show. Among them is the artist Ailsa Traves, who created the song you're hearing now specifically for this podcast. That in itself is just such a huge honor to me, so thank you so much, Ailsa, and all of you others that have contributed music. I haven't decided what topic is to come next, but I hope that it will be just as engrossing and unique as this one. I wasn't planning on making a 3-part podcast epic for my first ever story, so the next one might be slightly smaller in scope. It also might be a little less terrifying, if only for my mental well-being. So thank you all yet again. I hope you have a happy Halloween, because I know that I definitely need a drink or two after this. But for now, adios, and until next time, stay safe.